So there's a lot of benefits to running your amp through a 212 cabinet. You can combine different speakers or use the same speaker and have more air being pushed through the cabinet. But a lot of times you're only miking one speaker in both live and studio situations. So does the other speaker have any impact on the speaker being mic'd? Well, that's what we're here to find out. So as usual, I'll leave the time code for the sound sample so you can skip me talking if that's what you wish. But for the people who want to understand what this experiment is and what you will be listening to, let's get right into it. So I started this experiment wanting to switch out the speakers that I was not very happy with in a very budget-friendly Laney Cub cab. It's a 212 open back cabinet and it's very small, and the reason I picked that was because it's very lightweight and easy to transport. But before I replaced the speakers, I was curious how it would stack up against a 112. So I came up with this experiment to find out how much the other speaker is doing in a recording setting. Now, of course, having more speakers is going to push more air in the room and give you more volume. It's going to sound bigger and fuller. But if when you're miking a speaker center cone, that is typically done in a live setting or in a studio where you're just miking one speaker, does the other speaker being in the cabinet have any impact? And I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to really see how one versus two speakers in the same exact cabinet impacts the tone. So some caveats to go over first before we listen to this is, yes, there's two identical speakers, and this experiment is going to be me running a 50-watt Paul Reed Smith head into the speaker cabinet. You're going to hear three different examples. You're going to hear one, we'll call it the Laney speaker. It has some name, and I couldn't find any information on this speaker, by the way. There's no stats anywhere to be found, but 12-inch speaker, it's 50 watts. That's about all I can really tell you. I also have this Jensen speaker that I was curious about too. A little bit of a tangent off the experiment, but I also wanted to throw that in there to see how different the same cabinet and the same configuration would sound like with a different speaker. And I picked this speaker. It's a Jensen NEO speaker. It's older. I wanted to improve the sound because I was unhappy with the way the speakers were sounding. So I picked this one because it's super lightweight. All right, some things to keep in mind that doesn't make this experiment perfect. One of them being that both 16 wired in parallel would be an 8 ohm load. Now, when I remove one of the speakers, that's going to make it a 16 ohm load. So the 212 Laney is going to be a 8 ohm load. The 112 Laney is going to be a 16 ohm load, and the Jensen is going to be an 8 ohm load. That is going to affect the tone a little bit. Now, these are very subtle, but there are some differences when you're running an amplifier at different ohms. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, the other thing to keep in mind that is only going to affect this first sound clip that I'm going to show you, but I will address this in the second sound clip that I show you, is the volume. So when you have two identical speakers at the same sensitivity and you combine them, you add 3 decibels to their sensitivity, aka volume. Let's say these Laney speakers are at 90 decibels. I don't know this for sure because they don't have the stats online, but let's say they're 90. Together, they would be 93 decibels. But what surprised me, and you'll hear this, I was going to wait to talk about this until you hear the sound clip, but this is kind of important to keep in mind when you're listening to it, is actually the 112 speaker is going to be louder. It's going to be 3 decibels louder. I measured it. And then the Jensen, because it is a more efficient speaker, is going to be another 3 decibels. So you're going to hear an increase in volume when switching between each speaker. The reason for this is because I'm keeping the amplifier at the same exact settings throughout the entire experiment. Now, when you're running 2 speakers, the load is split up between them evenly, right? But then when I remove one of the speakers, all of that wattage is going to one speaker, which is the speaker that I have mic'd, which means that that speaker is going to be getting more wattage and it's going to be louder into the direct microphone that's in front of it. So even though having multiple speakers will be louder overall in the room, if you're only micing one speaker, when you unattach the other speaker but keep everything else the same, that wattage is going to be added to the other speaker and it's going to make it louder. So you're going to hear that in this sound sample right now, but don't worry, I'm going to correct this by volume matching using a volume meter to make sure that each one is exactly the same. And we're going to listen to that later. But first, let's go ahead and listen to the raw, unprocessed files in this experiment. So that was not quite what I was expecting, to be honest. Very different. One of the main things I want to talk about here is the 112, not just louder, but there's a little bit more speaker breakup because I'm running a 50 watt amp into a 50 watt speaker, whereas with the 212 there was 100 watts and the Jensen is also 100 watts, so the speaker capacity is double what the amp is, so we're not really getting any speaker breakup, which I always wondered what speaker breakup sounded like, but it was hard for me to ever hear because I'm usually distorting the amp, and it's kind of hard to tell the difference between the amp distorting and the speaker distorting. So that was really cool to be able to hear that. So that was like the main thing that I heard. So now that we've heard that, to eliminate one of those variables that was negatively affecting this experiment, the volume change, I went ahead and volume matched all of these recordings using a volume meter and making sure that they were all exactly the same volume. So let's go ahead and listen to that and see if there's any tone differences with the volume exactly the same. Very surprised once again. I thought the Jensen was going to blow these speakers away because I just didn't care for them when I listened to them, and I compared them to my Warehouse ET65, which is just probably one of my favorite speakers that I've heard. I was a little disappointed. I was like, man, I feel like any speaker is going to be a improvement, but the Jensens weren't as big of an improvement tonally in the recording setting. I think it will be better for for the purpose that this cabinet is serving, which is a portable rig to go jam with people or maybe play shows with. The extra volume that I get out of the Jensen is going to come in handy because I'm going to be using it with a small lunchbox low wattage amp. So that's going to be beneficial. The Laney was a lot warmer, which I was thinking it was going to be the opposite, because the Laney on its own sounded really bright to me, but then in the comparison, the Jensen sounded brighter. That frequency is going to help the lower wattage amp I'm going to be using with it cut through in a live band mix. I still think it's an improvement and an upgrade, so I'm happy with that. But in terms of recording in the studio, I feel like I might actually like the Laney better, but that could change depending on the style of the song, of course. But I do want to know what you think, so please let me know what speaker you thought was the best and if it's worth adding a second speaker in your cabinet. But if you're interested in cover songs, production tutorials, pedal reviews, anything music production related, you're in the right place. So go ahead and subscribe if that's interesting to you, and I hope to see you in the next one.